Welcome back to Tulsa Bioscience Chromatography Expert. This is our second podcast on pre-packed columns. I'm Fudong, and join me today, I have Dr. Kevin O'Donnell.
Hi, Fu. Good to be back.
Great. And today, the podcast, we will focus on a little bit more details on pre-packed columns and why pre-packed columns fits well in a GMP operating settings in most of biopharmas.
Thanks, Fu. Like I said, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. And I've been around for a long time, sometimes longer than I care to admit. But I've been working with columns, pre-packed columns, and chromatography for a long time.
Yes. And Kevin has been in the industry for a long, long time, and his column packing expertise is known to the industry. Kevin, the first episode that when we talk about pre-packed columns, let has a very quick recap on on that episode. We talk about pre-packed columns and its benefits. Let's talk about that.
Well, pre-packed columns are the latest thing now in the pharmaceutical industry related to downstream processing. And Toso Bioscience has just introduced an entire line of pre-packed columns up to and including, at the current time, a 1-liter size column called the Skill Pack product line, including, like I said, up to 1 liter. So ours is called the Skill Pack 1K Max columns. And the advantage of these columns is very, very broad. The first thing is that the scale, when you get up to about 1 liter in size, are indicated for or targeted for GMP type production. So what does that include? So we call ours the GMP ready, which means that they are produced with very high quality. They are provided with excellent performance characteristics, including asymmetry and play count. They are also tested for bioburden and endotoxin, which is important as you would move any piece of equipment into a clean room. In addition to that, there's a lot of different things that come along with it as far as documentation goes. The documentation may be the most valuable part of the whole thing in total, because what happens is you're getting these columns from a qualified vendor. We would be, Toso Bioscience would then be that qualified vendor. And then you would also have the methods that are used to pack and test the column are validated. So we've taken that out of your hands as well. And in addition to that, we would provide a regulatory support package, which would indicate that all the components are Class 6 or better as far as their leachables and extractables. And in addition to that, you would then have access to the entire regulatory support package. A lot of the validation that is done is pretty straightforward. Things like the asymmetry and play count, as I mentioned before. But we also do things like validate the shipping of the column to make sure that it's going to be able to function and perform exactly the way we determine on the C of A when it actually enters into your facility and your clean room, so that the performance is done. And that might include things like ISTA shipping studies, those types of things that would be very important to the end user.
Is that true? All pre-packed columns are GMP ready?
Not all GMP columns are GMP ready. We will have our GMP ready columns starting at about 1 liter and up. Now, as I mentioned last time we talked, we have a lot of smaller columns, 100, 200 mils, 50 mils, that type of thing, even down to 5 mil size. Those are not necessarily designated for GMP. They can be used with a little bit of extra work, but out of the box, we will start with GMP ready at 1 liter scale and larger.
Let's make it short. GMP or no GMP is about what?
Well, the GMP it would be very difficult to provide to customers a column that is called GMP. So most manufacturers of prepack columns, ourselves included, provide columns that are readily available to you so that you can easily put them into a GMP environment. You can think of it this way: as our GMP, if we were to do them as GMP, might be slightly different than, say, one of the larger pharmaceutical companies. So therefore, is a GMP based on their standards and definitions? Maybe, maybe not. So by us providing as much documentation as we can, then what we do is we provide the columns to the customer in that way. Now, one way to think of this is that GMP includes validation. It's very difficult to validate a pre-packed column as a pre-packed column packed with a particular resin in a particular size, because you would have to go through and do things like shelf life studies or how much pack numerous columns to be able to say that it is a validated method with, precision. You can't do that with large columns, say of 10, 20, 100 liters in size, because what happens then is you would have to pack 10, maybe 20 columns to do all the validation of that particular column size in that particular resin. So therefore, you have to kind of validate the methods that you're doing to pack those columns, not so much the column itself. And that's where there's a little bit of misunderstanding, if you will, when people talk about pre-packed columns and validation.
So now pre-packed columns, which I understand that it needs to meet the industry standard, right? As you pointed out, shipping, validation of how good a column is and things like that. So, what is a well-packed column?
A well-packed column, primarily a well-packed column, is a column that will perform as it is intended. So therefore, the first thing you want to do is look at how the resin is placed into the column body. You want that to be nice and uniform. You want it to be evenly distributed throughout the column. You want it to be stable once it is packed in the column. It doesn't shift during the operation. And how do you measure that? Well, people have looked at all sorts of different ways to analyze columns that are packed well. They've done things like X-ray analysis and NMR, which are great ways to look at a column, but they're really not feasible when you get the larger scale columns. Another technique that was used for monitoring the packing of a column was using ultrasound. Fascinating technique, but it was actually quite expensive to do. So it never really caught on because of the expense of the equipment to pack the column. And so therefore it's not used. And it all boils down to using the age-old standard of asymmetry and play count. The original analytics that were used to measure pre-packed columns. These were done very, very early on with size exclusion resins and reverse phase resins. And the idea there is that the sample that is applied to the column, and this is a non-retained sample, gets introduced into the column, and what you look for is the dispersion of that sample. Is it evenly distributed across the top of the column? Does it flow through the column in a nice uniform or laminar fashion so that when the peak is analyzed as it comes out of the column, the peak shape is symmetrical and narrow, or in other words, has very low variance as it comes out of the column. And that gives you some numbers that can be statistically treated to give you things like asymmetry, which would measure how much the sample is distributed radially along the top of the column to make sure that that's even. And then as it goes through the column, the distribution or dispersion as it flows through the column in a very uniform fashion. So an ideal column then can be analyzed very quickly using asymmetry and plate count.
Oh, so based on what you just informed me, right? Um, so who would dictate the parameters of a well-packed columns?
When you look at chromatography theory, the original idea behind chromatography theory was based on very early on. It was the petroleum industry where people were looking at distillation techniques. And what they were looking for was a means to calculate how efficient distillation was in the petroleum industry. And so what they defined was a plate. And a plate is a region of equilibration between maybe one phase versus another phase. In liquid chromatography, it would be equilibrium between the liquid phase and the solid phase. So the equilibrium then can be defined as how many of those regions are in a particular column. So if you have a lot of regions of equilibration, then you have a lot of plates. And when you have more and more plates, you have the ability then to have better and better separation. So when you look at the separation technique, you want to try to have as many plates as possible. Now, there are a lot of factors that go into determining what number of plates there are in a column.
So it's mean that when a column that well packed, the parameters that people have to consider, as you pointed out, like blade counts and things like that. So if I get a column home, and can I go, above or be or for example, flow rate parameter? Can I go above that, or should maintain with the specs that you created for that particular column?
The specs for a pre-packed column are largely determined by the particular resin that goes into that column. Now, we talked about asymmetry, which is the radial dispersion of the sample across the top of the column. That should be uniform throughout the column. So if it passes through the column without having major obstructions to the flow, it will come out as a nice symmetrical peak. So your asymmetry should therefore be approximately 1. When you then apply the sample and you look for the dispersion as it goes through the column longitudinally, you then have different factors. You have the factor of how much does it diffuse as it's going through the column, and diffusion in the upward and downward directions. So if you're flowing faster, that will be minimized. When you look at the flow as it comes through the column longitudinally, you need to look at mass transfer. So that's the ability of your molecules to get into and out of all the little pores or nooks and crannies as it goes through the column. Too slow for the longitudinal diffusion and too fast for the mass transfer. And therefore, you have that balance. There's another term which is included in the Van Deemter equation, if you want to get into the theory, and that's the eddy diffusion. And that's just the multiple pathways that a sample will flow through a column. And with eddy diffusion, that's pretty constant no matter what the flow rate is. Typically for flow rates in liquid chromatography, the eddy diffusion term is constant. Now, if you go really, really fast or really, really slow, and I mean, we're talking about very, very extreme flow rates, the eddy diffusion term then takes on a little bit greater role.
So is that apply across all different molds of resins, or
Actually, no, it's independent of the resin, and it's mostly dependent upon the particle size of the resin. If you look at very small particles that are uniform in size, you have an optimal situation where your eddy diffusion, your longitudinal diffusion, and your mass transfer are all minimized, and you end up with what is called an optimal HETP, or height equivalent to the theoretical plate. Now, what we do at TOSO is we take HETP and we take the inverse of it, and then we divide by the particle size, and we get what's called a reduced plate height. The reduced plate height takes into account all the different particle sizes that are out there. And with TOSO, we have quite a few different particle sizes. So in order to compare columns of different sizes, we use reduced plate height, which helps us focus in on a well-packed column.
can I put it this way? When it comes to pre-packed columns or column packing, there's no one size fit all.
No, the endpoint is common.
Mm-hmm.
You want to end up in the same place, no matter what resin or what size column you pack. But getting there is a journey that can sometimes be very fun, and it can also be very frustrating. So when you pack different resins, you have to take into account all sorts of different physical characteristics of the resin. The first one, as I mentioned, is the particle size. You want nice uniform beads in order to get optimal performance. But in addition to that, you have the physical characteristics of the rigidity of the resin itself. Is it a soft resin? Is it a medium hardness resin? Or is it a hard resin? Each of those are important in the quality of the packing that you get. The other parameters that you look at are sometimes the mode. For anion exchange and cation exchange resins, you have negative and positive charges that are present, and you want to make sure that there's no ionic interaction as you're going in and packing the column. In addition, you have HIC resins, hydrophobic interaction chromatography resins. Those have regions of very high hydrophobicity, so sometimes you want to make sure that you don't have bead-to-bead interaction because of either the ionic charges or the hydrophobic regions.
Everything you just said about pre-pack, for that reason, all of the pre-pack columns have to be qualified. That depends on resins types. That depends on the particle size. That depends on its chemistry and everything like that. But I knew, in fact, some of the resin, okay, is not traditional resin, like for example, hydroxyapatite, for example. So why is that? I mean, like I thought resin is resin, but actually no. Some are just very different.
Yes, yeah, they are. And as I mentioned, you have the soft resins and then you have the more rigid resins. And when you pack those, you have to take that into account. When you get to things like hydroxyapatite, which is a very rigid resin, that can be very difficult to pack because it's just a little bit different in its physical properties. For example, when you pack hydroxyapatite, there's no compression associated with it because it's so hard. So as it is packed and the bed begins to form, if there are little imperfections in the way the hydroxyapatite settles into the column and you don't get a nice even distribution, those minor imperfections can propagate through the entire column. So as a result, what happens is that when you qualify hydroxyapatite columns, typically you will see asymmetry factors between 0.8 and about 2.2. So there's a much broader acceptance criteria for hydroxyapatite when you compare that to, say, some of the more traditional, even softer resins that occur. Now, the other thing too is that what we found with hydroxyapatite, in order to get rid of some of those minor imperfections in the packing, is if you do a gentle vibration as the column is being packed. That helps to settle the resin a little bit more uniformly through the column, and you can typically get a better pack. The other problem with hydroxyapatite is that it's very fragile. It breaks very easily. So therefore, if you're too aggressive with your packing technique, you can cause breakage of the resin, which creates fines or particles that are not spherical in nature, and they pack differently than what would happen if you have a nice uniform spherical particle. When you have all these fragments, that leads to inefficient packing, which is then propagated through the axial dispersion of the sample going through. And as a result, then you get asymmetries, which are typically greater than 1.0.
Now, if the end user decided to pack a column themselves for the GMP operating environment or in that lab. So is it true that all the requirement, okay, that make sure that column compliance for the GMP environment need to meet the requirement of the GMP just as the way that you did describe earlier?
Yes, in a way. What's interesting is that when we talked about validation, even validation of columns that are packed by the end user. When I've gone out and assisted customers pack their columns, typically they are basing all of their work on smaller scale, and they move up to a larger scale. So there's really no way that they could, in the pharmaceutical industry, pack their column 8-10 times to try to validate the packing techniques. Usually what they do is they try to use their best guess for conditions by doing and taking data from small scale experiments. And so they try to get their column packed the first time, hopefully successfully, using techniques that are not necessarily validated. That's where we come in. We can take our expertise with our resin and our columns and come up with hopefully a very high success rate for the packing of our columns. And then we can transfer that to a customer. Now, a customer may not care how many times it takes us to pack a column to get it to be a successfully packed column. Certainly that's important to us, but that all the customer wants is a column that performs well out of the box for them. And that means taking it and putting it into their GMP facility so that it then can be used as intended in a GMP environment.
So does it mean that pre-packed columns are very convenient for the end user then?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It saves a lot of time, it saves a lot of effort. And as we talked about before, column packing at one point was very much an art rather than a science. It's slowly changing, but that being said, there still is a good deal of art that is involved in the packing of columns. And we take that out of the end user's hands and provide to them something which is um, almost a finished product, at least from the point of view of what we do, it's a finished product. But for them, it's something that they can plug into their particular purification process and use, hopefully successfully.
Well, thank you so much for your time with us today. As you just listened to Kevin O'Donnell on the pre-pack columns, if you have any question, please visit TOSA website or reach out to us or Kevin O'Donnell directly. We're more than happy to answer your questions about pre-pack columns. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Fu. Always a pleasure.
Great.